Yo, what's going on? Today I really want to talk about one of the most often questions that I get, especially when I'm posting about my murals, and that is, Thomas, what are those letters and numbers in the background? What do they mean? What are those letters and numbers? What are those letters and numbers? I get that all the time. Basically, it's how I scale up my work. It's called the lazy grid or the doodle grid, or, it's originally called the chicken scratch by an Australian artist, but a lot of people just know it as the lazy grid or the doodle grid. So this method of scaling up your work is a very basic concept, basically utilizing technology to help you out as much as possible. The concept is all about just making markings on a wall to use as a reference for whatever you want to sketch out. In this example, I'm basically just writing a bunch of letters and numbers, and you can do squiggly lines, circles, shapes, anything that you want to. You just want markings on a wall to use as a reference. So I just use letters and numbers because it's just easy for me to go down the wall and consciously just throw something down. So after I have a good amount of letters and numbers on the wall, all I do is take a picture of that wall and throw that picture into my iPad or my phone into a program called Procreate. But you can use Photoshop or whatever sort of graphics program that allows you to layer images. And all I'm gonna do is just throw that image into that program and then throw the image that I want to paint or sketch out on top of that image and just turn down that opacity. That way I know exactly how the image that I want to sketch out relates to the reference marks that I just put on the wall. And I like this method a lot because you're able to easily scale up the image or scale down the image on the fly. So I'm able to say, you know what, I want this image to be a little bit bigger on the wall. Let me just scale it up in my iPad. Or I want this image to be a little bit smaller. Let me just scale it down in my iPad. So now that you're done with putting the image on top, turning down the opacity and scaling it up based on your preference, all you have to do now is just sketch. So usually I just lock that layer so it doesn't move around by accident. And I just go on the wall and I just sketch. So you can use your iPad, you can use your phone. Usually I just transfer that file to my phone. I just use that phone while I'm sort of on a ladder or on a lift, and I just sketch out the image on that wall. And all I'm doing is just following those guidelines that I have on my iPad in that program. So I do this for most of my murals now. So regardless of how big it is or how small it is, I use this method to basically, scale up the sketch that I want to do. And I just did a mural in Milwaukee that was about 60 feet tall. I used this same method. It's the same method that I'll use on a wall that's 10 feet tall. So this method basically you can use on large and small walls. The only thing you really have to look out for when you're doing a really large wall is how you capture that image of the wall you just marked up. So when I did the wall in Milwaukee, I took a picture, but I also had to do a lens correction so that it's not distorted, because when you're doing a large wall and you're sort of capturing it, especially like on my iPhone, it will have a wide angle lens, so it sort of distorts it a little bit so that it can capture a lot more. So I have to go back and actually correct that distortion so that when I lay the image on top of that, it's laid down correctly. And the basic concept, like I said, is basically making markings on a wall. So really, you don't even have to have letters and numbers or squiggly lines or whatever on the wall. Sometimes you can just use the wall itself and what's on there as a reference. So a lot of my murals sometimes have an abstract background that I put on first. So I'll take a picture of that abstract background with all these different colors, and then I'll use the different colors and the splash lines and this and that on the wall that I just put on there as a reference on where to put certain elements so that my proportions are right. I used the same concept on another wall I did in Milwaukee that was sort of small, and it was basically, it had wheat pasting, it had sort of scratched the paper on there, and I just took a picture of it and used the actual wall, what was already on there, as a reference on where to put my line. And really this concept is to really just make sure that you're getting the proportions right, or you're sketching what you need to on the wall correctly and saving time. But you can just mix it up right after that with freehand elements. So I do that all the time. When I'm doing a portrait, I'll do the lazy grid method, but then after that, I'll just do everything else freehand. So you can do this method anywhere on any wall. Before, when I used to do murals and had to grid out my murals, I was using this thing a lot. It's basically a chalk line and making chalk lines for perfect squares. So having to measure everything. This method, I don't have to measure anything. I just have to be able to take a nice picture of it to sort of throw into the iPad. One tip that I do have is that when you're making your markings or whatever you want to on that wall, that you use something that's transparent rather than super opaque. Mainly because you're trying to cover up everything, all the markings that you've done, you want to make sure that it's easy to cover it up and it's not going to take a ton of layers or sort of really opaque paint to sort of cover it up. And the last tip is, you know, the amount of markings you have, the more references you have when you're sort of making your sketch. So certain areas don't need a lot of markings. So if you're doing something like hair or a galaxy or, you know, something that is large in space, you don't need a ton of markings when the image is not that detailed. But when the image is detailed, or an area of that image is detailed, you can add more markings to that area. So you can, you know, if you take a picture and you see that you need more markings to help you out, get the proportions right, you can always add more markings and take another picture and use that picture as your sort of starting point in those layers. So basically, like I said, this technique is really cool. I use it a ton now that I sort of gotten used to it. It has sort of cut down the amount of prep work that I have to do whenever I'm starting a mural. So basically I can get the proportions right the first time in a couple of hours. So that is the reason why I have letters and numbers in my work all the time, but I cover those up. Those are basically just my guide when I'm sort of starting out and basically sort of building up the sketch, but they're all covered up by the end. So definitely go out and try this technique. I'm pretty sure you will love it. Like I said, it is efficient, it's effective, and it's fun. It's fun to actually get proportions right the first time. And like I said, you can mix it up with freehand as well. I do that all the time. Some things I need to get right just the first time because I don't need to spend a lot of time outside. You know, mixing it up with the lazy grid technique and then freehanding everything else. Doing a good mix of everything is always good. So hopefully that helps out when sort of learning more about how to scale up your work. And I will see you on the next video. Peace.